You can.
Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. In America, we hear a lot of talk about addiction. Maybe around the world. I don't know. I've only ever been to America, but I know that as long back as I was in school, we had to take classes on addiction. They taught us about addiction. We saw commercials about addiction. So I figured we'd have on an expert on addiction today. He is a psychologist, author, retired professor of justice, law, and society at American University, and a former member of the psychology faculty at Johns Hopkins University. Professor Jeffrey Schaler, welcome to the show.
Hi, Michael. I'm very happy to be back with you again.
And I'm very, very happy to have you here. So, how long have you been researching addiction, and what drew you to the field to begin with?
Well, I've been researching it as a graduate student since the 1980s. And then I zeroed in on my dissertation and wrote my dissertation at the University of Maryland, College Park in psychology, focusing on what people believe to be addiction. Because prior to that time, I had been invited to represent the mental health profession by the Montgomery County, Maryland County Executive and the County Council to represent the mental health profession on all matters concerning addiction. And I really didn't know the controversies back then. That was in 1981 or so. And I innocently responded to what someone said when they said addiction is a disease. And I said, of course it's not a disease. You're just using that for rhetorical purposes. It's not a real disease like cancer. Well, if somebody wants me to keep talking about something, all they have to do is tell me to shut up. Because when I said that, I was denounced, lambasted, criticized by the county council members, not the county, the council members. This was called the Addiction Advisory Council. And I was on it for 6 years. It was pro bono. And they just went berserk. And I thought, what the heck? Why are you getting so upset about this? Well, I realized that the ones who were really upset had a history of trouble with drugs. And they had been taught to believe that if they questioned the idea that addiction was a disease, they would go back into self-destructive behavior with any kind of drug or habit that got labeled as an addiction. So I noticed myself and other people did not believe that addiction was a disease. And I was curious, what were the characteristics of those persons versus the ones who were hardcore believers? And I also studied Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. And I have since realized that those are cults. Not only are they cults, but they're religious activities. And when I said that, they started bringing out the hangman's noose. I mean, they were ready to both burn and hang me. I did my dissertation on why is it that certain people believe this and others believed in what I back then and has since been adopted as the free will model. And I'll give you some specifics, but let me just mention a couple things. The people, and this was all scientifically validated, statistically significant, all those fancy words, that the people who believed it was a disease tended to be men, tended to be Catholic, and that was followed by Protestant, Jewish, agnostic, atheist. And that was all a statistically significant relationship. What that meant was that it just wasn't by chance. And then I explored that further, and I realized that what were the core issues in this huge I just stepped into it, and it really had to do with sense of power, personal power, black and white thinking, and how people coped with life. Those were the real issues. And I developed my dissertation on that. I defended it. I got about 5 or 6 articles published in peer-reviewed journals, and I was a big success on that. But then I began to discover this more in terms of my interactions with people. For example, and I debated this nationally, why were they so upset? Why were they so upset? And like I mentioned before, because if they doubted it, they were taught to believe that they would get back into trouble. Well, then I used common sense, and I said, you all know people who have quit using drugs, heroin, smoking, cigarettes, etc. How do you think they did that? Well, obviously they made a choice. They made a decision to stop. And that's why I did a book called Addiction is a Choice, because I studied all the research and I found out that there was a tremendous amount of scientific research that showed that environment and how people experience their environment had more to do with using and not using than any kind of gene or mutation of a gene or the physiological chemical nature of a substance, all of that stuff. In other words, there was no physiological difference between those people we called, quote, addicts, and there were no chemical characteristics of any drugs that made them use.
Okay, well, hold on a second. So I'm familiar because when I was incarcerated, I attended AA, NA meetings, and the first thing they tell you is the first step is you're powerless over addiction. And that always seemed crazy to me because on one hand, you're telling me I'm powerless, and on the other hand, you're telling me that I can do something about it. If I'm powerless, I can't do anything about it. And I agree. I found it to be very religious in nature. I think 7 of the 12 steps, something like that, mention God, or maybe it's 5. I don't know, but it's a lot. It's a lot of the steps mention God. And any questioning of the disease model was very frowned upon. And they basically told us, if not actually told us, that you cannot quit alcohol or drugs unless you have AA or NA. But you just said something. You said that there's no physiological difference. But hasn't there been an abundance of studies showing that there is a genetic link to addiction? And also, hasn't it been shown that some people's brains respond differently to drugs than other people's brains?
Well, to answer your first question, no. The second question, haven't there been studies that showed that people's brains respond differently to different substances? Well, of course. Everybody responds to substance differently, and there are physiological changes. For example, some like ice cream, some people like chocolate, and undoubtedly there are physiological changes associated with that. But the core issue here, Michael, the core issue is, can you control your behavior? And that gets to a core concept in addiction studies, and that's called loss of control. Loss of control is a phrase that came out right after the temperance movement in the 1930s, when repeal of prohibition occurred. And a guy named Jelinek wrote a book called The Diseased Concept of Addiction or Alcoholism.
Yes.
And he claimed that there were some people who could not control their behavior. And he speculated that this was due to some physiological, genetic, some kind of difference. It has never been found. This difference, this gene, it's never been discovered. And many psychologists—
hold on one second. Hold on one second.
Sure.
Because I don't want to lose my train of thought. I'm not saying they found the gene. What I'm saying is, haven't they found a high degree of heritability for alcoholism?
Well, that's a good addiction. And I'm glad that you mentioned that. But let's think about that from a rational point of view.
Sure.
Just because behavior is similar from one generation to another does not mean that there is a gene or something physical that's responsible for that. For example, these are learned behaviors. If your grandfather watched his grandfather or father cope with stress by drinking bourbon or scotch or whatever it is, then he learned through observation to cope with stress through the example set. And we know that the example set is the lesson learned. So it can go from one generation to the other. And that's just a learned behavior through observation, has nothing to do with genetics or physiology. But why this is important, Michael, is because as soon as people start saying physiology, they're going to eventually end up with the loss of control theory. And the
Yes.
loss, and why this is important in addition is that when it comes to criminal behavior, if somebody says I'm an alcoholic or an addict, and that's why I killed this person or robbed this person, etc., then they argue on the basis of some variation of the insanity defense. In other words, they say I couldn't control my behavior because I was an addict.
Sure.
Absolutely no evidence to support that at all.
Well, I agree with that. Yeah.
Right. But that's where this loss of control theory leads. Now, you mentioned you had to give up a sense of power. And that's very important, too, because, again, let's look at this from a common sense point of view. It's if you're taught that you can't do something or that you're powerless, you're more likely to prove that to be true. And if you're taught that you're powerful and can tackle something and be success at it, then you're likely to prove that to be true. So what's happening in any disease model based treatment program is that they're teaching people the exact opposite of what they should be learning. And that, to me, from a psychological and common sense point of view, is very important. Now, look,
Right.
It's just like with this whole transgender thing. I think people have a right to say that they are whoever they want to say they are. It's just that whenever you get the state involved, like with AA, and I was on the first case involving the First Amendment rights of an individual who was arrested for drunk driving. He was told that he had to go to AA, and he was an atheist, and he said, I might as well listen to Jimmy Swaggart, who was a evangelical minister. He said, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God, and I don't want to believe in God. Now, so on that basis, like you said, God is mentioned in all these steps of AA, but that's not the basis on which we argued successfully that AA was a religious activity. There are other legal criteria, and I won't go over all those here right now because they're in my book, which came out 20 years ago and is doing well. The thing is, and I objected, that the state should not be involved in a religious activity at all. That's the most important thing here.
Sure.
I think that if people want to go to AA, that's fine. But another thing, Michael, is that AA has been found to be no more effective in helping people give up drug or whatever activity than leaving them to their own devices. And that's a big secret that people don't want to talk about.
In AA, actually, they tell you can't do that without AA. You said something a couple minutes ago, and you were talking about if somebody's taught they can't do something, they're going to believe they can't. And I remember reading Albert Bandura's book, Self-Efficacy.
There you go.
And he showed all the studies on self-efficacy, and that the people who had higher degrees of self-efficacy, meaning a higher sense of control, a belief that they could accomplish something, are more likely to do it. And that flies in the face of the whole admit that you're powerless over addiction thing. So I agree with you 100%. I just, from what I've seen, the studies that I've seen, it does say that even in twin and adoption studies, that there is a heritability component. What I don't agree with, though, is that does not negate free will. For instance, I could have a strong urge right now to go have a chocolate sundae. I don't then have to have the chocolate sundae.
Right.
And it's the same thing with drugs or alcohol. I can have a strong urge to, get drunk, get high, whatever. I don't have to do it because I'm a free agent, right? I can control myself.
That's a great point, Mike. I agree.
But a big question I have, though, is what is addiction? Like if you had to define it, how do we even define addiction? Because there doesn't even seem to be a clearly recognized definition of the term.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because in my book, I begin each chapter with an ancient use of the term addiction. It goes all the way back into the Bible. Like hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And what addiction means is simply devotion to something. And
Okay.
it could be positive or negative. You know, we talk about people being addicted to running, addicted to drugs, but it isn't just something that's destructive. You can be devoted to love, to art, to whatever it is, sports. It's only in the early part of the 20th century, associated with the temperance movement, which led to AA, that this idea that addiction was connected somehow to drugs. But for hundreds and hundreds of years, it's never been used in that sense. The other thing is, you mentioned self-efficacy. I'm very glad that you mentioned that. I'm glad that you read that, because so many people who defend the disease concept have never read any of that stuff. And Albert Bandura said a lot of very important things about self-efficacy. Yes, the more you believe you can do something, the more likely you are to do what you need to do in order to succeed at a task. It's not the same thing as saying, if you believe you can jump over this building, you're going to be able to jump over the building. That's not the way it works. It's
No.
more, do you have a positive attitude towards what you need to do? That's the most important thing. But the other thing, Michael, I just want to make sure I can remember this while we're talking, is that in AA, they would often come back at you and me and say, you don't have to use the word God. We welcome atheists, right?
Yeah.
But really, that's not entirely true,
No.
because even though the higher power, as they talk about it, could be anything, and they always like to say it could be the doorknob on the door, it could be the rug, it could be all this other stuff. But there's one thing it can't be, Michael, and you know what that is? It can't be yourself.
Yeah.
So if you say, I am the higher power, I am the one who's in charge of my life, they will say, you're in denial. And the
Yes.
favorite saying, and denial is not just a river in Egypt. It's, you're lying to yourself and other people. And that's just not true. You are the only person who's in charge of your behavior. And when some people say, well, something made me do it, and I didn't consciously or volitionally choose to do this, pardon my French, but that's just bullshit. All
Yes, it is.
behavior, all behavior is volitional, Michael.
Yes.
An epileptic seizure is not behavior. It's a neurological reflex.
Yeah.
And when we talk about somebody drinking or grabbing a drink or taking heroin and shooting it, they're not having a seizure. Although I
No.
must say, and years ago in the Washington Post, somebody from NIH said, oh, well, reaching for drugs or alcohol is the same thing as having an epileptic seizure. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
terrible thing to say to people who struggle with epilepsy and any kind of seizure-based disorder. They're not
Yes.
like drug addicts. They're not doing
No.
anything morally wrong, So, and the other thing is that what I can anticipate, because I've debated these people so many times, what someone would say in response to you and I. Well, you're advocating a moralistic approach to addiction, and we've tried to get out of that, and you're taking us way back. No, I'm not saying this is a moral issue in that sense. What I'm saying is that all behavior is the basis, is an expression of a person's values. How can it be otherwise?
It
And in that
can't.
sense, it's a moral issue. Is it important enough for you to keep using drugs? Yes, it is. And when do people stop? When it's important enough for them to stop. That's the bottom line. It's not that complicated. And I've worked with people as a psychoanalyst for 40 some years. And it always comes back to that. I asked them, well, why did you stop? And they said, well, it was important enough to me to stop. So there you go.
It's interesting to me that you say that, because I remember in 2004 was the last time I ever did drugs. I was in prison, and I had been doing heroin on a semi-regular basis for a little over a year in prison.
Right.
And it got to the point where I felt very uncomfortable in my own skin, because being an addict wasn't consistent with what I wanted to be. And so ultimately the cost benefit assessment shifted to the point where the pain of doing the drugs outweighed the benefit, and I stopped doing it. And I didn't use AA or NA. But you mentioned Jelinek a few minutes ago, and I think that this is a very important thing. He creates the idea of addiction as a disease. No, sorry,
Right.
alcoholism as a
Right.
disease. And
Right.
the initial evidence that somebody was an alcoholic and therefore had the disease was that they went through delirious tremens. So if you don't go through delirious tremens, you don't have the disease.
Right.
But then I disagree with that. But my only point is to show how these concepts creep, because then it
Right.
goes to, well, it's not just if you have delirious tremens, if you're drinking way too much, let's say, for whatever that means, then you're an alcoholic too and you have a disease. But
Right.
then they also
Right.
extend it to drug addiction, sex addiction,
Right.
food addiction. So it
Right.
starts off with one way of conceptualizing it, and then it just grows and grows and grows and grows.
Sure.
And that's
Sure.
why I think it's vital to nip that sort of a thing. When somebody starts making that type of category error where they apply one concept to another concept to which it does not apply, it's important, especially when
Right.
there's societal repercussions, to nip that in the bud, which of course, Dr. Saz tried to do, and you've been trying to do in Stanton Peele. But it's not an easy thing because for whatever reason, personally, I've always thought that addicts have a vested interest in the disease model because they feel it absolves them of responsibility. Because if I have a
You're
disease,
right.
it's not my fault.
Right.
Addictions might be tough to quit. Listen, God knows, I know,
Sure.
but there's a lot of things in life that are hard to do, but you have to do them anyways. And that's one of them,
Right.
right?
Exactly. I mean, I've gone over this with many, many people. Raising a child is very hard. Growing up is very hard. And that's when things are going well. Going to school, getting through prison. I mean, there are all kinds of things that people accept as difficulties in life. And that's what Thomas Szasz referred to as problems in living. Existentially, they're problems in living. And even when we're fortunate enough for everything to go our way, it's still very, very hard. And so, why is it that somehow we accept that all these other facts of life are difficult, but when it comes to quitting smoking or quitting heroin, it's too hard. It's a disease and people can't do it. Well, that's just nonsense. And there is harm in this lie being spread by the National Institutes of Health, of mental health, of all kinds of organizations that have connections with the state. And that upsets me and Thomas Szasz a great deal, because when the state is empowered to make diagnoses regarding behavior, then we have real trouble, real trouble. And that's what I and others have been working very hard on, separating medicine from state. That's what Thomas Szasz called the therapeutic state. And on
Yeah.
your last show, I was fortunate to be a guest on that. I brought that up. The therapeutic state, as Thomas Szasz referred to it, replaced the theocratic state, where church and state were combined. You're probably one of the most educated interviewers I've ever met, because
Oh,
you can
thank you.
cite category errors and Albert Bandura and all these people. They have no idea what you're talking about. I'm sorry, but you're absolutely right. These are very, very important people who've come up with very important ideas. For example, Albert Bandura once said that an unconscious thought is a contradiction in terms.
Well, yeah.
He eliminated the whole concept of the unconscious mind. In other words, if it's an unconscious thought, how can you have a thought unconscious? Thought is conscious. You can't do something that you're unconscious at unless you're talking about sleepwalking, etc. But that's not the same thing as claiming that your mind made you do something horrible. Anyway, the issue, which we will always keep coming back to, is volition and responsibility. Now, I don't know if we have time, but I'd like to just cite probably the most important scientific study that was ever done on heroin users. And it was released in 1972, 73.
Okay.
And when can I mention that briefly? Is that okay?
Sure. Absolutely. That's what we're here for.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, there were a lot of soldiers in Vietnam that were using heroin. And they were using it because it was easy to get a hold of. You had really high quality heroin and it was cheap. And when Nixon brought the troops home, he told the Veterans Administration, who then told a group of epidemiologists at Washington University in St. Louis, to find out how many people were using and stuck on heroin, because the Veterans Administration had to make preparations for treatment facilities. So the largest study of heroin users ever done found out something that many people want to ignore. And that is that out of 400 confirmed heroin users, and they confirmed this through urinalysis. It wasn't through a psychological assessment, which is highly susceptible to error.
Sure.
Out of over 400 confirmed heroin users, 87% of them gave up heroin as soon as they came home. Now, that's a big deal, because they interviewed these soldiers and they said, how come you could give up heroin when you came home? Is it because we have prohibition here? As what's his name? Wilson, the criminologist, I've forgotten his first name, wrote in a cover story
James
for
Q, I
Commentary
believe. You're talking about James
Yes,
Q.
exactly.
Wilson?
Yes. He wrote a cover article for Commentary magazine, and it was all about this study that I'm mentioning right now. And he interpreted it the wrong way. And none of the researchers agreed with his interpretation. But he said the reason they gave up heroin when they came home was because we have drug prohibition. And he used that as an argument to support continued drug prohibition. That wasn't it at all. When the soldiers were asked, why did you give up heroin? They said, we didn't need it to cope with our experience of being home. And that was one of the most important things they could have ever said, because that is related to the whole basis upon which we have this war on drugs. They said, we used heroin in Vietnam to cope with the horrible experience of being at war. Once we came home, we didn't need it anymore. Now, 87% of them gave it up, boom, like that, with no treatment at all. And that's where the researchers again said, is it because we have drug prohibition here? They said, absolutely not. We could give it up. Well, we're not, I mean, we're going to use whether we have prohibition or not. That's not the issue. We gave it up because we didn't need it anymore, and need it in a metaphorical sense. They didn't need it in the sense that they could cope with the experience of being home without drugs.
Right.
Now, people might say, why is it that the 13% continued using drugs, which 13% is not very many? Well, the bottom line is that those people tended to be users before they. And I think if we zeroed in on their life, we would see that their experience of living here in the US was like living in a war zone.
Okay.
Very unpleasant, chaotic, difficult type of environment. And so they use drugs to, and I say, numb themselves to the experience of being home. And that brings me to a whole nother issue, because some people say, well, what about the people who are given morphine and opiates when they've got some kind of surgical procedure, and then they continue on to
But
use
that's
drugs
so
after?
rare. Isn't that
That's
just
right.
very, very rare that happens? I mean, I know that that's what we're inundated with on the news, the opioid epidemic. It's because of the prescribers
Right.
and all that. But I've tried to find the stats on this, and I just can't. But from what I understand, it's a very rare phenomenon where people actually become addicted to drugs that way.
Well, you're absolutely right. There is no support for that argument, and I tend to interpret it this way: those people who continued using the drugs, like morphine and opiates, continued doing so for psychological reasons. In other words, they may not have recognized that they had a lot of problems psychologically before they started using the drugs for their surgical or physical, problems. But once they got introduced to the drugs, they realized that they could numb themselves to other things too.
Yeah.
And that became a great thing for them as far as they're concerned. I know because I've been on these opiates for 20 years because of botched surgery. And I went through the 60s and 70s. I was at Woodstock. I did all these drugs and I gave them up in a flash. Why? Because I realized I didn't like the consequences of those drugs. And I went into psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, and I studied yoga and meditation. And I realized that I was doing some things to myself that I did not like the consequences of. And it was very easy to stop using. I just made a decision, and that was the end of it. Now, I know that some people have a difficult time, Michael. There's no question about that. But they probably don't have that much support in their environment, and they have other things that they need to work on. But some people say, well, Schaler is advocating a model that basically says that people have weak wills, right? No, I think people who use excessively have what I call an iron will. And my friend Jacob Sullen quoted this in an article of his on addiction. He said, Schaler talked about this as an iron will. In other words, people will use these drugs regardless of consequences. That's the strength of their will. It's a very strong will model. It's not a weak will model.
When I was incarcerated, what you just said reminded me of my parents. Both were heroin addicts. They lived in Hartford, I'm in Connecticut, and I was incarcerated in Suffield, maybe a 20-minute drive, right? And it's right next door, Suffield, to Enfield, or it's right in the vicinity anyways. And for, my parents always had the excuse why they couldn't come visit me. There's no gas, the car's broke down, there's this, there's that, whatever. But then when they found out that there was a doctor in Enfield that was prescribing what they wanted, they found a way to get there.
Oh, wow.
They found a way. And that's what that reminds me. When you say an iron will, because in my experience, the vast majority of addicts are very strong, very resourceful people when it comes to getting what they want. And,
right.
So that was just very poignant when you just mentioned that. But you're not saying, right, Dr. Schaler, that you're not opposed to treatment for addiction, and you're not saying that it cannot never help anybody, right? That's not your point.
No, although I question what is going on in the name of treatment, because if they're teaching people that they are powerless, I think that's a bad thing. If they're teaching people that they have to believe in God or some religious activity, I have concerns about that only insofar as the state is involved. If people want to do it independent of the state, I have no problem. I think it's foolish.
But do you
I'm
think
an atheist.
But do you think there's programs and treatments that do help? Like, is there anywhere, if
Yes.
somebody's addicted to drugs, they're watching right now and they're convinced AA is not going to help them. But is there something that can help them other than just, hey, just stop?
Yes, I'll tell you. It's called Smart Recovery.
Okay.
I think it stands for self-management and I forget, and recovery training. I can't remember it, even though I helped start it. This was many years ago, and my colleague Joe Gerstein, a physician, and several other people put together a program based on cognitive clarity, and it's been highly successful. And it's basically common sense, though. There's no higher power. There's no disease concept. It's just what is it called? Cognitive. What's the full title of that? Cognitive
behavioral therapy.
Yeah, cognitive behavioral therapy, right. And my friend Maxie Maltzby, who unfortunately died, he set up a version of that and spread the word all over the country. He was a professor of psychiatry at Howard University. Unfortunately, he died. But also my late friend Morris Chaffetz, who was the founding director of the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, argued, and he got incredible criticism for this. He said that people could control their drinking and their drug use. Now, that's considered taboo in the disease model camps, because if you can control your drinking or drug use, that means that it's a choice, not a disease.
Yeah.
It undermines the disease concept. But you've got to understand, Mike, important this disease concept is to people who believe in it, because they truly believe it's like the word of God. And if you stray from that, you're going to create a tremendous amount of problem for it. But I think smart recovery and cognitive behavioral therapy, and all of this is offered, by the way, free of charge, except psychologists and social workers and others who use it to make a living. But there are free self-help programs like Smart Recovery that are highly effective. Another one that I helped to start was called moderation management, although I left because the woman who I helped distorted the meanings of addiction. She wrote a book called Moderation Management, and she, in one of the groups, she said that a member who killed his daughter did not have to talk about it to the police because it was a confidential type of thing in that group. And I disagreed very strongly. And I distanced myself from those people. And fortunately, the New York Times did a whole story on it and mentioned that Schaler, who was one of the people responsible for getting this started, has since left that group for this reason. But she ended up killing herself a few years ago. But that program was deeply flawed. And for example, they believed that teaching people to control their drug use would not work for people who had the disease of addiction. And I said, but you can't tell who has the quote disease of addiction because it doesn't even exist.
Well,
So
you
how
can
can you
tell. You know how
tell?
you can tell? The person that it doesn't work for, that person has the disease of addiction.
Exactly.
That's what they'll say.
That's exactly right, Michael. That's exactly it. So I said, you've got to change this. Otherwise, I don't want to have anything to do with you. And she found other psychologists who would support her, and they got into a lot of trouble. But unfortunately, it resulted in several people's deaths. For example, Audrey Kishline, the founder, got drunk and drove the wrong way down an interstate highway in Washington State and killed a father and his 12-year-old daughter.
Yeah,
And
that used to be thrown in when I would challenge the disease model.
right.
It was like Audrey Kishline was the automatic. That was the
Right.
go-to. Well, look, she left AA, and look what happened. So, as if the one
Well,
person would establish a paradigm, but that's what they taught, anyways.
well, Stanton Fields said some interesting things. He's a friend of mine, although he was wrong on part of this. He said, look, she went to AA, and this accident happened after she went to AA. And some people call this the abstinence violation effect. In other words, if you are taught to believe you can never drink again, that becomes too difficult for you. So you go out and drink too much, and then you have an accident and you kill somebody.
Yeah.
But I said that, this is not AA's fault. It's not controlled drinking's fault. This was Audrey Kishline's fault.
Yeah.
She would not take responsibility for herself, and she's the one who killed somebody in a very, very horrible way.
Yeah.
I don't think that she got enough punishment. Her sister or brother, I forget, said that she got off easy, like 1 or 2 years in prison. I think I upset a lot of people because I said that she should have had a longer sentence for murder, or she should have been given what Thomas Doss and I have argued for, and that's the Socrates option. In other words, give her the
Give her some
opportunity
hemlock.
to kill herself. That's right. And some psychiatrists went so berserk, they wanted to kill me. But I thought that was a respectful thing to do. But anyway, the point is she deserved a lot of punishment, and some of the results of her writings and teachings were very, very harmful to people. But again, those people were responsible for their own behaviors. It gets down to responsibility. So
that's what it always boils down to in the end. right?
It is. That's right.
Regardless, we have to take responsibility for our own behavior. And
Right.
if we make bad decisions, it's on us. And like you said earlier, some decisions are harder than others, but hey, life is
Right.
not always, a box of candy, or as Forrest Gump says, a box of chocolates. Okay,
That's right.
Dr.
No,
Schaler,
you're absolutely,
before I
yeah.
let you go, do you have anything else you need to tell us? Any pearls of wisdom? Anything I forgot to ask?
I think what's most important for people to remember is that freedom and responsibility are two sides of the same coin. The more you get out of the way and let people be free to do whatever they want, which means the repeal of drug prohibition, which I am a strong supporter of. I think drug prohibition has done far more harm than prohibition or than repeal could ever do.
Yeah.
But we have to hold people responsible for the consequences of their actions. If you're going to be free, then you're responsible for the consequences of your action.
Yes.
And that's why what we see today is all this nonsense about the opioid epidemic, and we've got to, keep people from contacting any form of drugs. That is paternalism. That's excessive state control, and we should not be doing that at all. Because basically, by eliminating people's freedom, we're going to eliminate the extent to which they're responsible for their behavior. If we treat people like they're children, they act like children, right? So that's the one thing I wish people would keep in mind. And again, I'm not attacking AA. I'm saying that AA as a religious activity like Judaism or Catholicism or anything should not be controlled by the state. And it is, but now we're making some progress because programs like Smart Recovery, and all you have to do is look up Smart Recovery on the web, and you can find a meeting near you, which is free. Read the writings. All the material is free. Take a look. I don't benefit anything from saying that. It's just, I think people will find it very useful. Okay.
Right. Thank you. And where can people find you?
I'm in Maryland. You can find me on the web, though. My last name is Schaler, Schaler. I'm happy to correspond. Somebody built a very nice Wikipedia page, and I'm happy to respond to inquiries from people. So get in touch. You can find me. I'm as close as your keyboard.
Thank you very
Okay.
much for being with us, Dr. Schaler. For now, I'm Michael Liebowitz. This is the Rational Egoist signing out. Remember, like, share, comment, subscribe. Until next time.